Work. You said some interesting things. I want to start off with that. I mean, one thing you said in the class, and this is really interesting to me. You said you don't accept anybody who was willing to embrace you. That was you as an individual without the attendant identity you have as your Jewishness. Could you elaborate on that? I'm rephrasing it a bit. Do you recall what?
Yeah, of course I do.
Okay.
Well, people who want to embrace me, say a Christian who wants to embrace me as a person, but doesn't believe my Jewishness is essential to me and is primal in me and therefore sufficient, is not embracing me. They're embracing their perception of who I am and who I should be. So it's not a real embrace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you also talked about another really interesting thing. You talked about the idea, in your view, getting rid of Jews is really getting rid of prophetic thinking. Could you elaborate on what you said in there, please?
My own understanding is that the prophetic is indigenous to the people Israel. It's the center of our being, which of course makes the people Israel profoundly unstable. And we worship an unstable God.
One second, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Let me readjust this. Right.
The prophetic is the indigenous of the people Israel, which is profoundly unstable, the prophetic. And we also have an unstable God, if you look even in the Bible. God is very mercurial. We don't know which way God is going to move. But it's also that instability and the critique that comes from it of worldly power is profoundly threatening. By the way, also to Jews, because Jews embodying the prophetic also as our indigenous, primal reality, also are the great strugglers against the prophetic. So periodically, people groups, nation states, charismatic leaders want to rid their communities, but sometimes the world, of this disturbing presence, the Jews. And I think that has a lot, the Holocaust comes partly from that.
Okay, I have the whole enormous amount of things here, which I know I can't get to, but of quotes that are very interesting. One thing you said in one of your books was, today the Holocaust is used as a shield against accountability. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, the memory of suffering can be a window into what we should be in the criticism of unjust power and atrocity, death. Or suffering can be used as a wall that keeps the now victor, the once sufferer, from being held to account. And the Holocaust is like that. The Holocaust should critique every use of unjust power, including unjust Jewish power. But in fact, we use the Holocaust to say that we as Jews are innocent in the Holocaust, but also in our power. And anyone who opposes our power is, in a sense, opposing the memory of the Holocaust from that perspective. So, for instance, in Israel-Palestine, the Palestinians who object to Israel have to be anti-Semitic. Why else would they object to Israel? Well, from the Palestinian perspective, they lost their land. They see Israel as a colonial movement. They have every right and rationale to oppose it. But our view is, opposing us is opposing innocence. Therefore, there has to be something wrong with you. And of course, because of our suffering, the Holocaust, in a sense, their opposition derides the Holocaust from that perspective.
You bring up this issue of various terms: Jewish power, Jewish, the Constantinian Jewish establishment is your term. Could you address that issue, the issue of power, the issue of, well, also that for now, there's a million issues, but.
Right. Well, today, Constantinian Christianity is the transformation in Christianity in the 4th century and beyond, where a small marginal sect, often identified as Jewish, became the religion of the empire. And therefore, then, everyone had to be a Christian. You were penalized for not being a Christian. And the church blessed empire because the empire gave the church privileges and monopoly on religion, etc. Well, today we have a Constantinian Judaism, not because we're the majority religion or majority people, but we've made a deal with empire. And we have our own empire in Israel. And most of our energies in America are garnered to support that empire, both American and Israel. And therefore I say we've had the development of a Constantinian Judaism. And if you object to that as a Jew or as a non-Jew, you will be disciplined and penalized.
Now, this has come up with a number of critics of Israel, especially Jewish individuals, but not only. Who exactly is the target of your criticism? Now, let me preface it that there are the Jews, there is, or that's bigotry, and many for overwhelmed, but there are the Zionists, the Jewish elite, the Jewish establishment, Constantine. I mean, who exactly is the problem in your view, per Israel, per in the power relationship to us? Can you continue things running that way? Who exactly are we speaking about that should be the target of the criticism?
Well, first of all, they're not enemies. They're people who mostly believe what they're doing is right and as a fidelity to Jewish history. I just think that they're misguided in certain aspects and are actually making it in some ways more dangerous to be a Jew. So it's not about enemies. But sure, when you talk about the Jewish establishment, you're talking about many wealthy Jews, not all. You're talking about Jews in government or advising in government, not all. You're talking about Jewish academics, many, but not all. In Jewish studies and Holocaust studies, these are institutional realities in American society which not only try to put their point forward, which is fair enough, they try to discipline other viewpoints, including those viewpoints by dissident Jews, or what I call Jews of conscience.
That segues right into the issue of the self-hating Jew. And I even went down and interviewed Sandra Gilman, who wrote a book about
I've read it.
He gave me 2.5 hours on that subject. But this comes up a lot. And I've heard an earful from various people about it, and different angles. Surely you've been called that. Could you address that?
Well, I have met one self-hating Jew many years ago, so I'm sure that exists. But typically it's used because the prophetic is employed to undermine an empire point of view, which they regard as the only way of being Jewish. So it's on them. But dissident Jews, Jews of conscience, are not self-hating. They're actually putting a lot of their life on the line for their Jewishness. The idea of self-hating Jew is that you never want to stand out, you don't want to be empowered, you don't want to fail, you're afraid of your own shadow, you hate your inheritance. I haven't met many of them or almost any of them, and most of the time it's used, and I would say 99% of the times it's used as a blunt instrument against prophetic Jews, Jews of conscience.
It seems to be wielded as the Jewish version of an anti-Semite. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's empire Jews, Constantinian Jews, feel they're being inundated and threatened by anti-Semites and self-hating Jews. They have this whole world where it isn't safe to be Jewish, except most of them are unbelievably safe and affluent. It's interesting. They're some of the wealthiest Jews and people in America, some of the most established, prestigious, have status galore. They're honored in our society. But they seem not to be able to experience their Jewishness and the critique of it without assigning a derogatory term to people who actually just disagree with them about what it means to be Jewish.
Okay, you talk about, I have it here, but it comes to mind now. There are a number of people in the Jewish community and otherwise, but mainly the Jewish community, who have suggested that anti-Semitism the real and imagined is basically the glue or the thread that holds the Jewish community together. And you brought out in your book along those lines that if you take away the Holocaust, I'm paraphrasing it, if you take away the Holocaust in Israel, what's left? I mean, could you elaborate on all that?
Well, I don't think anti-Semitism is the glue. I think the thought of anti-Semitism might be part of the glue. I mean, the Holocaust and Israel have become our central religious tenets in modern Jewish life. They're where we have our most energy deployed, our emotions, our liturgies. So if Israel was ever to settle with the Palestinians, for instance, 2 states, my own sense is there's a fear that then the Holocaust, because of the sense of anti-Semitism and they're against us, including the Arabs, would fade and will fade with time anyway. So there's an anxiety. What's next in Jewish life? If we're not besieged, which actually we're not, and if we were to lose our power, although we have plenty of it now, what would become of us? So they have an anxiety about their own Jewishness, and therefore will do a lot to keep any progressive movements that seek an interdependent empowerment with others. They're very afraid of that, and that's one of the reasons they're afraid of democracy in Egypt.
What have been the personal costs to you? I mean, you've been defamed and smeared, I presume.
Of course.
I mean, could you elaborate on? I mean, I've talked to people, who have lost tenure or threats of tenure. Mearsheimer and Watt have been blocked and a lot of things for doing their book. I mean, there's a lot of things and people out there. I mean, but what's been your experience?
Everything.
Could you give me some examples?
Everything.
Can you give me any kind of
Well,
how are you treated by the Jewish establishment community?
Everything. Let's go on. You could. I don't want to bring it up now.
Okay.
You have enough on that.
Okay. Is Zionism racism? Classic question.
I think that's too simple. But it's also too simple to say that there isn't a point there from another's perspective. So I think these issues are very complex. Can Palestinians say that Zionism is racism? Sure. Of course. That's how they experience it. Does that mean it's only that? No, I don't think so. But we have to listen to that account. What are they trying to tell us? If we have a society where they're less than or excluded, we should remember we've been in that place. I think it's very important to listen to the world. It doesn't mean that the world is always right, but the world has a very different perspective than American Jews do, than many Israeli Jews do. And outside America and parts of Europe, it's very different. And I travel to those parts of the world and speak about Jewish particularity and the Holocaust and Israel and the Palestinians, and it isn't easy because those other parts of the world feel that they've been censored and disciplined for thoughts that are natural to them, like South Africa. I mean, they overthrew a colonial imperial regime. When you talk to South Africans about Israel and Palestine, it's obvious to them that Israel is a colonial and imperial power. Now, we can say that's anti-Semitic, but that's actually their point of view, which isn't for them anti-Semitic. Does that mean we have to say Israel is only that? No, I don't. There are some Jews who do, by the way, and some Israeli Jews, but I'm actually a moderate on the question of Israel and Palestine. And I think the questions are very, very complex, which doesn't mean I can't also take a stand.
May I ask you, is modern Israel a genuine democracy?
For Jews, it is.
Could you elaborate, please?
Well, at least 20% of Israel is not Jewish. I can't say it's a democracy for them. I also wouldn't say it's a dictatorship. But for Jews, yes, it's a very interesting democracy. For Palestinians in Israel, and of course for Palestinians that are ruled over by Israel, in the West Bank, for instance, they don't think that's a democracy.
Could you discuss? I don't even how to. I don't even, not even sure how to pronounce this. The Lachrymos
Yeah, lachrymose.
view of Jewish history that, for many, informs Jewish identity. The idea of being persecuted left and right. I mean,
Yeah,
could you discuss
yeah.
that?
I think I have that view sometimes that Jews have mostly been persecuted. Of course, Jewish history is complex. There have been times when Jews have been accepted, and some Jewish communities or some Jews have been elevated. There have been times of peaceful relations, but yes, a large part of Jewish history, in Europe especially, is characterized by struggle and suffering. And there are other people who see it a different way. But to see it simply as Jewish history is suffering until we have power also means that you never accept power as mitigating the suffering, because suffering is always around the corner. So in Holocaust thinking, for instance, the Holocaust isn't just past. Most of these thinkers on the Holocaust and people who speak about it really think that the Holocaust may come again. So it's a dangerous way of thinking, but it's not without factual basis. It's just not all of Jewish history.
For those people who believe that, how does this work now? Israel is the refuge, the haven for Jews of the world, yet it's sort of obvious that it's the most dangerous place for a Jew to be. How do they reconcile that, or what's your sense? You actually wrote that a lot of Jews are in Israel are leaving Israel, diaspora Jews, and they prefer to identify themselves as Israelis rather than Jewish. And could you address all that?
Yeah, well, Jews, yeah, it's peculiar because you figure, well, we have a state, it's a very powerful state, but Jews always feel that it's under siege. And therefore, the idea that Israel protects Jews is something that Jews will say, yeah, that's our protection. But actually, Jews feel that in some ways, subconsciously, sometimes consciously, that the state of Israel is fated somehow. That everyone's out to destroy us, and one day they'll destroy us there too. It seems contradictory, but there's also a need to see Israel under siege to keep this other sense that there's kind of an internal anti-Semitism. Now, is there anti-Semitism in the world? Yeah, of course. Is it eternal? I don't know. Is it affecting us in a deeply negative way today? No. Could it? I suppose. But oppressing another people in the Middle East won't make that less likely. It makes it more likely.
Does Israel foment anti-Semitism in your view?
I don't think Israel itself foments it, but its actions certainly do. And I try to separate anti-Semitism, which is a kind of a mythic sense of Jews, from actual things we're doing wrong. But because of this history, it's hard to separate what should be separated. You know, in the medieval Christian imagination, Jews were always doing something wrong. That was on their brain. But we are actually doing something wrong to Palestinians. These are two different things.
Let's see. What's your thoughts on groups like Chabad? And I bring it up in the context of your class here in terms of out-group, in-group, inclusion, exclusion. And the question I want to present to you, or the idea, and I like your feedback, is in our multicultural, tolerant, diverse society, America, that's the ideal anyway, you have groups like Chabad who, by definition, reject all of that. Do you have any? I guess the question is sort of about the idea of Jewish particularity, and I've heard this a number of times in the kind of extreme. Do you have any take?
Well, I have
on
a
that?
very strong sense of Jewish particularity. It's not a Chabad sense. I think they have every right to be and to promote their point of view. And I find it interesting when the Jewish establishment and local synagogues resent them for presenting a form of Judaism, which they think is foreign to them and may be. And it's not my form of Judaism, but it certainly is a form. So I believe in the free expression of ideas, more of the marketplace, including religiously. But, you know, those who are self-righteous about Chabad against them, what are they doing in life? You know, are they empire enablers? Now, Chabad might be too. But I would critique it actually more on what it does than what it believes about itself.
Okay. Jewish particularity, could you elaborate on that? You have an
Well, Jewish
identification.
particularity is a sense of being Jewish that is somewhat different than others, has its own history, and to which one is dedicated. I have a very strong sense of that. But Jewish particularity isn't only in wearing yarmulkes and praying at certain times or of the day or demonstrating in public that you are, or speaking about Israel as if it's the golden age. You know, many Jews who are not Chabad demonstrate their Jewishness by supporting Israel, Holocaust memorializations, shutting down others. Jewish particularity is very complex. What does it mean to be Jewish? And there are different ways of being Jewish.
Well, may I follow that up? Because I've asked, that's an obvious question. Who and what is a Jew? What is peoplehood? Is being Jewish, is it a religious idea, a worldview? Is it a cultural thing? Is it an ethic? Is it racial? Is it, going down the list? And there's this term peoplehood that comes up a lot. For someone like myself, raised Catholic, all that stuff is new until I came to the Jewish community about it. Could you elaborate on what it means to be a Jew? What is that? What are we talking? And in the context further that you have suggested in some of your books that there's some kind of terminal point per Israel, that there's a change point coming or something. You take a very profound spiritual view, I guess, as I interpret it. Could you elaborate on that? What's a Jew? Who is it?
A Jew is somebody who stands amid Jewish history and is open to the questions, responses, arguments in Jewish history, and places their heart, mind, and body in that history, so participates in it, engages in it, in order to create a Jewish future. Now that means the questions, including the question of God, do not have to be resolved or affirmed or negated in a certain way. Israel, the state of Israel, is an important part of Jewish particularity today. And no matter what stand you take on it, if you're not engaged in it, my own view is that's a loss. That's the same thing with God. And, but to me, the center of being Jewish is the prophetic. And there may be no meaning or reason to be Jewish without that.
And could you summarize that? I mean, we're talking heads here. I mean, your books are about that to some degree.
Yeah.
The prophetic. What do you mean by, for the average layperson who isn't Jewish, what are we talking about here?
The prophetic is that movement in history embodied in certain persons and communities or groups that tries to gather light in the darkness and tries to assert meaning in the world over against the apparent meaninglessness through acts of justice and compassion. And in the Jewish world, we gave birth to the prophetic. It's our great gift to the world. Now, there are prophets outside the Jewish community now, but the prophetic is distinctly Jewish. And therefore, if the prophetic ever ended in Jewish life, it would have a profound effect in the world.
So you're discussing justice as a central pillar?
Justice is not just material justice. It is, but that has to do with the dignity of the person. It has to do with the destiny of a community or people. It has to do with the question of God. So justice seems to simplify it. Okay, if we have justice, the prophetic is accomplished. No, because there's always injustice. There's always exclusion. There's always a squandering. The prophet is deeply engaged in the hope of humanity and the squandering of that hope.
Somewhere here I have where you alluded to the notion that the Jewish community has been very active in social movements and that to uplift the human community and all that. There's some people I've spoken with and don't agree to that. I guess the issue is, how has the Jewish community in history cared for others who are not Jewish until, I'm saying that the Enlightenment, everybody starts caring. I mean, the Christians, everybody else, Jews, it broadens, the universality thing. But before that, is there historical evidence that the Jewish community in the prophetic tradition opened up to non-Jewish groups to lift them in the sense of justice and these things you're talking about?
Well, of course, a lot of that history we don't really know. We only have the Hebrew Bible, which is a way of rendering a history. We don't know what really happened. But there have been times in Jewish history where the stranger, for instance, even in the Bible, is to be welcomed and treasured. So there are aspects. Obviously, there also is a very strong internal aspect, but then who were Jews? When you talk about ancient Israel, who were they? Most of them joined in one way or another. So it's a very complex situation historically, but no question that has broadened through the Enlightenment, through the prophetic taking on a more modern sensibility, and now especially in relation to the Palestinian people. The covenant between Israel and God has expanded. Now, Christianity usually thinks of itself as that expansion, but I think that's a self-righteous understanding. In fact, Christianity can often be very narrow in including those who take on its belief structure. I think Jewish history, of course, is very complex. There is a very strong internal thrust, no question. Whether that was shaped more through history of anti-Semitism, but also the sense of being set apart, probably both.
Okay. You bring up John Marie Cuddy a few times, and some of the I have a bunch of quotes here, but one of the things you brought up, you say, quote, "One of the themes of this essay, Cuddy's, is the need for those outside Jewish life to interact critically with us, the Jewish community, in the same way that Jews have interacted critically with Christian life." Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. We as Jews have, since the Holocaust, somewhat before, but certainly since the Holocaust, have discussed not only what it means to be Jewish and defined it for ourselves, with Christians listening, we've also ventured into Christianity and criticized parts of it, mostly for its anti-Semitism. And my own view is we had every right to do that. But we don't let Christians criticize us. Now, they shouldn't return to an anti-Semitism of defining us and defining all of our good parts as being bad. That's different. But there has to be some way. I mean, it's patronizing to think that Jews can criticize and not be criticized themselves. And after all, we've taken on it power, and sometimes that power is abused. Shouldn't Christians who are repentant for their past advise us of the path that we might be moving on, which looks a lot like their path?
Well, let me ask this, in this kind of political climate that exists, for anyone, from what I've seen and read, for anyone to criticize anything about the Jewish community is grounds to be assailed and smeared as an anti-Semite. So how is it possible, what you're soliciting, how is it possible to enter the discourse of a kind of mutually critical exchange, when by definition, if you're not Jewish, even if you're Jewish, I mean, you Finkelstein, right, you're shut down as a bigot right from the start.
Don't accept that definition. It's time to investigate that definition and the material conditions behind it. When the interfaith dialogue was one of real searching and coming to a deep reckoning about Christian and Jewish history, I support it. But over time, it became what I call the interfaith ecumenical deal, where Jews tell Christians about the negative parts of their history, which are many, and Christians see Jews as innocent in our suffering and in our empowerment. No people is innocent in their empowerment.
And how does that inform the issues surrounding the State of Israel then? How is that
The State of Israel can't be criticized, because that's considered anti-Semitism by those Jews, mostly Constantinian Jews, who need a certain worldview and a certain power to continually assert their view of right and wrong and what's pro-Jewish and what's anti-Jewish. But those definitions are not accepted by most people, including now most Christians who are in the interfaith dialogue. Actually, when you talk to them privately, they want to get out of it.
Yeah, I have that somewhere where you talk about, in conversations you say with various Christian individuals, I don't remember if it's the Marino people or what. There's dissent. There's a sense that they want to step forward and criticize, particularly Israel.
Right.
But there's a hammer.
There's a hammer, but that hammer is losing its power because mainstream Christian denominations, including the Presbyterians, have passed resolutions that are binding on their church in terms of boycotts or divestment, mostly, sanctions, against Israeli policies toward Palestinians. So, Constantinian Jewish establishment has lost everything except its power.
And how is this power exerted, and where is it?
Its power is all over the place, and it's around every corner. And if you're a Jewish dissident, a Jew of conscience, you feel it. If you're a Christian of conscience who wants to speak, you'll feel it too. Oh, it's from everything from local Jews visiting presidents of universities to have Jews fired, to speaking engagements canceled, jobs not. It's all over the place because everybody seems to be afraid of being called an anti-Semite. I wouldn't, I don't think it's good to be called an anti-Semite either. If you are an anti-Semite, that's wrong. But opposing Israeli policies toward Palestinians is not anti-Semitic. It may be pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, but we don't want to hear it.
When I speak to people who are emphatically for Israel, in support of the situation now, roughly, two things always come up. Demonizing Israel, that term, demonizing Israel and delegitimizing Israel. Those are the kind of pillars, from my experience, of those who want to defend Israel. Can you elaborate on that? What is that about? What's your take on that? Those two pillars, that is kind of the defense of modern Israel.
It's just another argument to deflect accountability about what we're doing.
Okay.
I mean, at some point, we can discuss this, and I've written about it forever. At some point, it's just over. You just have to say, I'm done with it. I can't get back into that argument. It's a rearguard argument about delegitimizing or demonizing that has nothing to do with the reality of what Palestinians have suffered. And it also demonizes and delegitimates Jewish dissent, including in Israel, because the Israelis who are leaving Israel in droves are also seen as anti-Semitic or self-hating. So where does it end? They're the ones who have returned. They're the ones who have fought the wars. American Jews haven't. They've had enough. So at some point, the argument's over. Let everyone have their point of view, no problem. But I don't want to go back into that, demonizing and delegitimizing. The reason that there's so much demonizing and delegitimizing are the policies. So it becomes almost impossible to argue Israel's case in the world for good reason. Does that mean there is no way to argue Israel's case? No. There is. It's a very complex argument. But you're not going to make it anymore by trying to hide behind the shield of innocence. Nobody in the world accepts it. Nobody. I think including the people who tell you that's the only thing they want to hear. It's over.
Well, here's a quote, if you could please elaborate. You say, have Holocaust, it's a rhetorical question, have Holocaust historians turned the writing and teaching of the Holocaust into a field of inquiry that has its own standard and reward structure, which one enters with fear and trepidation? Could you elaborate on that? Holocaust historians and...
Well, Holocaust studies, Jewish studies, it's like being admitted to a club, any club. I mean, all departments and universities or programs, in a sense, are a club. And they determine whether your Jewishness is right or wrong, whether your thinking is right or wrong. There's an orthodoxy. And they also tend to try to police the university structure beyond their own departments or programs. So instead of furthering a critical examination of Jewishness, Judaism, the Holocaust, Israel, not always, but often, they're there to defend against the delegitimizers and demonizers. It's endless.
You talk about Edward Said and Cudahy again, and I have a quote here, but I just from their perspectives, both analyze the Jewish world in a way that most Jews cannot. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, we have so much internal understandings of Jews, Judaism, Holocaust, Israel, and I'm one of them. But I also travel around the world, and I listen to other voices who are not Jewish. So we need more non-Jews to investigate critically with a solidarity with the Jewish people, but not romanticizing Judaism or Jews or the Holocaust or Israel. It doesn't, a true friend of the Jewish people has got to tell us the truth. And we need more non-Jews who aren't invested in the system but are looking from outside. Looking from outside is not everything, but it's something. And we don't want anyone looking from outside because we're afraid of what they see.
Interesting. Another quote, please. You're talking about Goldhagen. Does Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, remind us of a time when Jews were weak and helpless rather than empowered? And you ask this, and do Jews prefer this self and public understanding of victimization precisely because this is not our condition today? Could you discuss that?
Sure. Well, if we were weak and helpless, we wouldn't be able to project our power. But we're not willing to say we have power. So we want it both ways. We want to project our power, but we do it through the guise of our helplessness and our vulnerability. But there's a disjunction there, which is more and more evident. When you say Israel is vilified, demonized, delegitimized, is weak, people look, especially say Palestinians, and say, oh, tell me about their weakness. They've experienced that strength. Does that mean everything's going to be hunky-dory for Israel? No, not at all. I think there is a vulnerability. I think there are a number of crises and crises ahead. But yeah, of course, if you can have it both ways, and of course, all power wants to be seen as innocent. The United States sees our power as innocent. We don't think we do things wrong. So that's true with all power, but it's particularly true now in the Jewish community. We don't want to say, yeah, we suffered, now we're powerful, we'll drop the suffering because we might even cause other suffering, but too bad. No, we say we couldn't cause suffering because we've suffered. We couldn't do something wrong because we're innocent. And therefore everybody who does something wrong against us is wrong. It becomes a syllogism, which is very self-serving.
Again, this issue of Jewish power or empowerment, and to what degree, who and what are we talking about here? And mainstream Jewry comes up, I think, in the discussion by you and other people. I mean, mainstream Jewry exerting a particular power. Could you elaborate on that? And then there's an individual like you and some who dissent from all of that. But could you talk about what are we talking about when we talk about mainstream Jewry?
We're talking about Jews in politics, Jews in business, Jews in the academy, rabbis, Jewish organizations, Jewish lobby groups. We have this structure within the Jewish community, and we have Jews in the larger structure, and we've made it. So we're at power points, and good for us. It's merit. And we have a right to a distinctive view of the world. We don't have a right to enable the oppression of others. That's where I draw the line. So Jewish power isn't only used for bad, not at all. It can be used for good. But Jewish power is everywhere. Does that mean that Jews are only powerful? No. Does that mean that Jews are weak and helpless? No. We're in a new situation. We're not on the run, but we're causing other people to be on the run. What does that mean what does that mean about our power and our use of power?
I don't know if you heard of this guy, but one of the people I've interviewed his name is Henry Herskovitz in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I'm wondering where you stand on what he's doing. I talk with him, and there's 3 other Jewish individuals who are always with him, always. Every Saturday, this, he protests. And the reason, he argues, is it's the flag, the icon of the Israeli flag in the synagogue system. And his argument is it's endemic to the mainstream Jewry, the Israeli flag, and he's where do you stand? And it's very controversial. It's a house of worship. So where do you stand on a thing like that?
I'm not against it. I haven't joined it, but everyone has their witness.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't met him, but he has a point for sure. It's like Norman Finkelstein. I don't write like him. I don't have the exact same views as him. I don't speak like him. I'm quite different, but he has made some very important points, very, very, very important points about Jewish life. All of us need to listen. So, it's not like everything has to be our cup of tea to be listened to. They have points of view. And I'm with parts of those points, but I'm myself. But I certainly wouldn't condemn him. I mean, should we go on worshiping as if nothing is happening? That's the same thing we criticize Christians about. I think that's their main point. I agree with it. Whether he should do it every week at that synagogue, or that's up to him.
This is a question that comes up I've seen it a few times. Why be a Jew? Why stick to it? What's the attraction? I mean, my sense in your books, the ones I've seen, is you face kind of moral crises. I'm putting words in your mouth, but apparently there's been times when you've been pretty roiled by what you've seen, what you discovered, what you heard, what have you. You talk about even when you're a kid or something. Some things in the synagogue repulsed you. I don't know if this is your word, but and I've seen this question before by scholars. Why be a Jew now? What's the attraction?
Well, it isn't so much an attraction. It's just constituent of my being. I can't really explain that. It's primal to me, central to my life. It doesn't always have to be easy. And for most Jews, it has hardly ever been easy. Right now, it's only easy for the ones who are riding the coattails of empire. But if you're a dissident, it's not easy, but I'm Jewish. I'm not going to run from it, and I can't run from it, and wouldn't think of it.
Okay. I don't know if I'm correct on this. Let me pose to you. I know that for sure there's a lot of Jewish individuals like yourself who are teaching in Christian colleges, whatever. Is that reciprocated very much in the yeshivas and stuff? Are there Christian?
No.
Why not?
Well, the yeshivas are much more, a strict yeshiva is much more like a parochial school. Now, there are parochial schools that have Jews. I mean, Christianity has this sense of the universal. I don't actually buy into that universality, but and there are very few Jewish colleges or universities, so we don't have a sample. But clearly, Christians today are more open to Jews at the heart of their life, and including who they read and who, these Jewish thinkers that I've just written about have been tremendously influential in Christianity. And there's no Christian that has been as influential as any one of those thinkers in Judaism. So Jews do not reciprocate in that way, and that's an interesting point to think. But the main point, I think, is that for Christianity today, Jewishness complements them. It reminds them of their origins, it broadens them, it deepens them. Jews are very afraid that the Christian message might be very attractive to Jews. They want to keep that away.
That brings up a segue. I mean, there's been a lot of hostility to the cross, to Christianity, and understandably from the persecution angle. But is there the idea of assimilating into Christianity has always been a hostile idea in the Jewish community, correct?
Well, it has been, but maybe we already have. Maybe our Constantinian Jews are the real Christians of our time. Maybe we've become thoroughly Christianized. Maybe Jews of conscience are rebelling against that Christianizing.
Could you elaborate on the details? Or what do you mean by that?
Well, let's think about it. We've taken on everything that they've done, including a triumphalism, an insistence, a blessing of empire, a use of our religion now for status. We've done everything. Maybe we've become the real Christians of our time.
The words, this has come up before, the issue of status and the term moral capital per the Holocaust, and the way that the Jewish community is so heralded in this culture as victims. Could you elaborate on that and how that's a tool for Israel?
Well, the Holocaust functions, the memory of the Holocaust functions to buttress this claim that Jews are innocents in our suffering and in our power, and that our links with empire are innocent. It should do just the opposite, since the Holocaust victims were victims of empire, but we use it in a different way. But in the end, people don't believe it. So there was moral capital, if we use that term, after the Holocaust. Oh yes, because we had really suffered. But we've squandered most of it and trivialized the rest of it.
Okay. It's well taken, the things you say about Christianity and all the investigating all the crimes or all the evil things, so forth and so on, and the undergirding of anti-Semitism in Europe. But the question I have, and I've asked this to other people, what about if you go to the Old Testament, the Torah itself? There's a lot of nasty things in there, including the recipe for genocide, which how. And I asked Jacob Neusner this. I interviewed him. We talked about him. I asked him, well, when you come to that, where there's multiple times where God commands the Israelites to massacre every man, woman, child, apparently the Amalekites, I don't recall. How do you handle that? I mean, as a Jewish,
What did he say?
He said, we don't teach that, but it's there.
Sure, it's there.
So,
well, first of all, we don't know that that's a history, real history, and there are all sorts of disputes about what happened there. But certainly, it's in our canonical books. That's certain, and so it's formative. Well, I've often thought about that because Christians ask me that question. It's a good question. So I look at that history, say 3,000 years of history in the Torah, let's just say, and then the 2,000 years of Christian history from Jesus to Auschwitz. Which is more violent? You just don't have them, Christians don't have them in their canonical books. But I see the New Testament as Jesus to Auschwitz. There's plenty of violence. So let's just say there's plenty of violence to go around. Mm-hmm. But there are also other things in the Hebrew Bible and other things in Christian history. A loving God, just God, compassionate God, all of it. Mm-hmm. So we don't know that it happened in history, what is recorded there, but it is in our canonical books. And I hope that I would have had the courage to stand up against it. But I couldn't stand up against it then. But I'm standing up against it now. So what gives Jews the motivation, if they have that as their foundation, to stand up against violence now? Well, because Judaism, like Christianity and Islam, have evolved over time. It isn't just scripture, it's also conscience. It's thinking about history. So I would say that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but also Enlightenment secular people, should think about the history that they inherit, because all of it's filled with violence and other things. So Judaism or Jews are not more violent than others. That's ridiculous. But we may not be less violent, which Jews don't want to hear.
And you're speaking historically? Or are you
and that, well, we know now, since we've assumed power, that we do just about everything that was done against us. So for 1,500 years or more, we didn't have power, more or less. And we look at that as we didn't do anything wrong. Well, maybe it was because we didn't have the ability. Because we're catching up now, big time.
Mm-hmm. You make a lot of very interesting points. Here's another subject. You say the forces of Jewish renewal, interesting and provocative, are small, and most Jewish progressives are now employed by or serve the Israeli and American states, at least in their thought and theology. And in other places you've alluded to your perspective, if I am correct, that Jewish progressives, so-called, a lot of them are really not they're part of the problem still in terms of Israel. They haven't distanced themselves. Could you elaborate
Yeah,
on that?
progressive Jews like Michael Lerner and Arthur Waskow and Brian Walt have been they're empire Jews. They're what I call the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. They have a civil war with the Constantinian Jewish establishment, but if you look at what they believe and what policies they favored and what they won't countenance over time, you'll concede that they're much closer to Constantinian Judaism than they would ever want to think. Jews of conscience have broken from progressive Jews and progressive Judaism because they realize it's a done deal. They're collaborators. It doesn't mean any of them are bad people. This is not my issue. Michael Lerner, Arthur Waskow, Brian Walt is just 3 examples. Rabbis for human rights are the left wing of the Constantinian Jewish establishment. They have been part of the problem. Now, some of them ultimately break from that and become Jews of conscience. Now, are Jews of conscience going to solve this question? No, because we live in the golden age of Constantinian Judaism.
Okay, and I think you did mention this, but again, a definition of Constantinian Judaism. Could you give me a definition?
Are Jews that are deeply embedded in the American and Israeli empire.
Why is it, as you say, quote, the Holocaust the most remembered and studied subject in history, unquote?
Well, part of it is ascendancy of Jews, what Jews have met in European and American civilization, Christian repentance for the Holocaust, empire in Europe and America, everything. And because the event itself was so massive and so destructive that it was a novum in human history. So, all of those things. You ask, why are Jews elevated in the discussion of suffering over, say, Native Americans or, say, African Americans? Well, it could be that Jews are more deserving. It could have to do something of our power. But also, Jews have always narrated Jewish history as the center of history. And that goes back to the Bible, right? So we have a propensity to narrate our history as central to history. Which I do too.
Along those lines, I've interviewed the 2 Roma Gypsy members of the Holocaust Council. Their name is Ian Hancock and
I don't know them.
Okay, both of them have summarized their experience in the Holocaust Council. They're both bitter to this day. And it has something to do with what you just talked about, which is to say they have felt point by point their experience as gypsies and there's some scholarship agrees, some doesn't. Was point by point the same as the Jewish experience. So their experience, you were talking about how the Jewish experience, or it's from the Jewish narrative, and these guys want in under the Holocaust umbrella. Could you discuss that?
They're not going to get in. This is the contemporary sense of Jewish chosenness. They're not getting in.
Elaborate on that, please. Why?
Because they're not Jews. It doesn't fit in our narration.
So so you brought this up elsewhere, the idea of chosenness and uniqueness. I've interviewed a guy who did the book. How does that inform all this too? Then the Holocaust as this uniquely Jewish, chosen by God for a negative thing.
Yeah.
Could you discuss that? How traditional parts of Judaism come to inform it in a secular manner?
Well, if you have millions of people who died in World War II, and this new book on the Bloodlands, which is fascinating, and sees Poland and the Ukraine as caught between the German and Soviet empires, and millions of people, of which millions of Jews also died. But Poles were decimated, and Ukrainians were decimated, and they were starved to death, and Soviet prisoners killed, and it was a mess. But even when I teach the Holocaust, that all drops away. I teach the Holocaust in a very traditional way. And as I say in my new book, it's not justified, even though I will do it until the end. Because the Holocaust, for me, but for all Jews, is about Jewish history. And in some ways, it's about our election. And I participate in that too. Is that fair to others? No, it's not fair. And the reason that Jews can do it is not simply because of our internal power, partly it is, and our narrative ability. It has to do with our status in society, and partly to do with our wealth. So we need to, critically evaluating where we are as Jews is not being negative about Jewishness. It actually becomes more interesting. It's fascinating. Jews are fascinating. But when we look from other people's views, a lot of them feel, well, you're usurping our story. Where are we? Are we less than? And in general, Jews believe, yes, they are. Now, no one's going to say that, of course. It's not politically correct. So, for instance, you'll have books, entire books, and multi-volumes on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And they'll start out with saying, yeah, the Russians lost whatever, 20 million people. So they lost more people. And this happened. And they, so everything, yeah, but still, this is unique. It doesn't matter that there was more tragedy there and that everyone's equal. They always assume that. They always say that. But it's not equal.
Well, then then you won't change either. What is that about then? Is that
Jewish particularity?
Could you elaborate on that?
This is one of the ways that I express and we express who we are as Jews in a culture which has not prized Jews and in a culture which almost annihilated Jews. But it's faded. It can't be forever because it's the way I do it. I understand what I'm doing, but I also understand that it is a way of projecting Jewishness as central to world history. Do I believe that Jews are central to world history? Yes, I do. Can I defend that against African Americans or Palestinians? No, it can't be defended. Do I feel that? Yes. Now, we just need to be honest. But then people are going to resent that too. And we need to think, well, okay, so they're saying, where am I in this story? Well, we don't know how to do it another way. And what is the fear? It's the same fear that Constantinian Jews have. If we don't hold on to this, we may disappear. People may not care about us. Not just negative. It's not just about people might hate us. The big thing for Jews is they may not think we're distinctive. They might not care. It may not be important to them. I remember a discussion with my professor, Richard Rubenstein, about liberation theology. And he said, well, a lot of that's anti-Semitic. And I said to him, since I had been to Peru, liberation theologians in Peru don't think about Jews all the time. They actually think about Peruvians, of which a very small percentage are Jews. They don't have Jews on their mind all the time. That's frightening for Jews. Because from the beginning, we not only accentuated our importance in history, we were always afraid of disappearing from history. It's very Jewish. And I have that inside me too. And this is the difference between, one of the difference between someone like Finkelstein and Chomsky and others who think that they don't have that inside of them, that it's not important to them. But they're so Jewish in the way they argue their dissent against that exceptionalism.
Very, very, very interesting.
Okay, we only have a few more because then I gotta.
Okay, well, geez.
Well, we spent a lot of time. Okay. You're only going to put me in there for a minute or two, so.
Not if you're this good.
Well, I'm always this good, but that doesn't mean I ever get there because you got more famous people who are more famous for these other reasons. It's okay. I'm not bothered by it. I'm having a good time, and I'm very glad to talk to you.
Okay. Well, now I have to choose. Okay.
Yeah, because I'm a limited human being.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. You're great. I understand 1,000 things. Why have Jews been in the forefront of the civil rights movement here in America? Yet the principles of that civil rights movement, the things they undergird and fight for, they don't transfer to the Palestinian issue and the Israeli issue. How do they, that paradox or that dichotomy or hypocrisy, whatever it is, could you
Well,
discuss
first of
that?
all, not all Jews were involved in the civil rights movement, although there were Jews. And some was about justice, which came from our tradition, and some was a particular sense that this was a people who was also struggling for liberation. So, in a sense, we saw ourselves in it. But also because we wanted a more open society. We benefited from an open society. And breaking that open further, but keeping our ascendancy. No one feared in the Jewish community that African Americans would threaten our ascendancy. If that happened, the break would happen. So it was out of goodness, out of justice, out of our tradition, but also out of, in a sense, it was a wedge issue to open American society further for us too. And if African Americans had been then on an equal par with us, and as it became a little closer, the Jewish community split over it. Because we as Jews want to be ascendant. That's another fear we have. If we're not ascendant, we're dead. Now, is that true? Question. But all the movements that we're in, we keep an ascendancy. And of course, African Americans, and this was part of Black Power, resented that ascendancy. They say, wait a minute, you're now defining us. And I remember once almost having a fist fight with a guy, Siegel, who wrote a book on creating a Palestinian state. So here's a Jew telling the Palestinians how to create their state. Very Jewish. Jews also told African Americans how to do the civil rights movement. Now, does that mean that all Jews were imperious? No, of course not. There were many of really decent Jews who did it for the right reason. But again, we're analyzing. The Palestinians are a threat to Jewish ascendancy. And after all, they're Arabs. Now you think, well, there's a very big racial component there. So you think, well, why was the racism against blacks less than the racism against Arabs? Well, maybe we're more militarized now. And maybe they seem to be a direct threat. And of course, what is the threat? They unmask the fact that Israel isn't only innocent.
Okay. You say another quote. The fear is simple. If the sole content, you've touched on this a bit. If the sole content of Jewish identity revolves around the purity of the Holocaust and Israel and suffering and innocence, then the confession of culpability introduces a dissonance that threatens the entire identity structure. You touched on it. Could you elaborate on that some more? The idea that the Holocaust in Israel is at the root of modern Jewish identity.
Absolutely. They function as God in the contemporary Jewish community. They are the highest point of our emotion, our memory, our ritual. So it's like a conception of God that is no longer credible. What happens? People fear it. This is the fear that Christianity had. When Christians began to say, our theology leads to anti-Semitism, which I don't want, the fear is, well, then what would be left of Christianity? Well, there may not be that much, or there may be something else. But the fear of letting go is there. For Jews, the fear of letting go of the Holocaust in Israel is immense. It's our deepest anxiety. So it's going to be let go of at some point, and more Jews are letting go of it, time, distance from the Holocaust, but also dissent against Israel, which now morphs into an apathy. I'm not apathetic, but many young Jews say, I don't care. So that the attempt to impose that identity is fated. It's fated. But everyone's afraid that there would be nothing left. There might be nothing left. But that would be because, primarily, the violence that we perpetrated in the name of trying to keep it together. But the prophet is not afraid of there being nothing left, because the prophet sees everything being squandered. That's the prophet. The prophet thinks you're squandering everything in your protection of injustice. Now I'm going to go, but if you want to meet me again, I'll talk to you.
Okay, you know what?
You want to stay? I'll talk to you for another hour, but I can't do it right now.